I knew zero English when I moved to the US, and I actually got in a lot of trouble for not understanding my first grade teacher when she would speak to me in English. But fast forward to third grade, I was getting the highest English scores, winning the school spelling bee, and setting the foundations to become the graduation speaker and debate captain of my high school. Learning English was a tricky process for me, and I couldn't have done it without my ESL teachers. And surprisingly, video games. But there were 4 tactics I used as my secret weapons to become more fluent in English, and in this video, I wanted to share all 4 of them with you and the mistakes I made along the way learning English, in the hopes that maybe this will help you or someone else in their language journey. Our story starts out in the elementary school playground. I was a terrified but excited first grader, fresh off the proverbial boat from Haiti, ready to make friends, learn about the world, and finally understand what those strange sounds around me called English meant. I was deeply fascinated by the English language, but it was quite different from my own native Creole, and I could tell early on that it was going to take some work and elbow grease to learn it. Some of my first memories of English are of hearing words like tag, run, and no, run that way. Sounds that were completely foreign to me at the time, but when I'd see a group of tiny legs running away from me shrieking, "Run!" for the 10th time, it would finally become clear to me that run meant courir, and I took off sprinting, kickstarting what would become the adventurous tale of my journey to learn the English language. This part of the story is important because the first instances of really learning English happened for me during play. Those moments when I was so focused on just having fun with friends that English became a tool for me to unlock adventures rather than a homework item to finish. And my brain would open up to soak in the language in a way it rarely did otherwise. Now, don't get me wrong, reading and formal studying were big parts of my English journey, but I wanted to focus on the gaming aspect of my English fluency experience for this video because it's not often talked about, but I think that gaming has some superpowers that could help a lot of language learners. So I'll share my experience and maybe you might find some success with things that worked for me. But let's return to another language playground, this time in my home. Like a very traditional Haitian household, I was not allowed to go to friends' houses growing up, and we didn't have the space in our small hut for me to invite friends over. So video games became my connection to the outside world growing up. They would introduce me to my first friends, throw me into new worlds, and occasionally transform me into a hero on a mission to save the entire world from certain destruction. One of the first games I played was a dungeon crawler called Fate. It was a single-player game that had you going into dungeons to fight monsters, collect weapons and armor, learn spells, and fish for rare items. But while I was focused on beating gels and bats and cave beetles and zombies, unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize that I was also getting a daily language lesson, being introduced to words like cutlass, saber, scimitar, falchion, anvil, shrine, and many more. So imagine my teacher's surprise and my own when phrases like "the hero brandished a cursed scimitar and faced his ghoulish foe" began to find their way into my writing at school. I had no idea where my brain was getting those words from, but they somehow felt familiar to me, and they quickly started to become part of my growing English knowledge. While my kid brain was focused on playing games and having fun, all those words were quietly sneaking into my brain from all those hours I'd spent playing games like Fate. So this was the first tactic that I unconsciously included in my language learning journey that made a big difference. I exposed myself to advanced vocabulary from niche games. Games are often a great source for discovering words you don't come across in your day-to-day. I mean, how many of us spend the day using vocabulary to describe enchanting weapons to imbue them with frost resistance before exploring a dungeon, like in Fate? Or terms related to mounting a horse or riding a dragon, like in Skyrim. Those big fantasy worlds can have thousands of items, characters, locations, and creatures, and to a language learner, all of these are unique and often uncommon vocabulary waiting to be soaked up and learned. And a superpower of games is that you often bump into the same words repeatedly while on quests and adventures. The word scimitar might confuse you at first, but by the 8th time a merchant tries to sell you the overpriced sword, your brain will probably start to glue the word to its meaning. The vocabulary was my first step, and while I would recommend more niche games with advanced terms, for a beginner like I was, even games with simpler terms like Rumble Fighter that I moved to, with words like waiting rooms, synchronizing, and battle over being repeated every round, they started to become vocabulary lessons for me too. After the 5th or 6th time seeing over, my brain would finally say, "Oh, over can sometimes mean fini." And without noticing what was happening, more and more words jumped into my vocabulary. But words weren't enough to become fluent, which takes us to the later stages of elementary school, where I picked up the second tactic. As I climbed through elementary school, I started to transition from single-player games to MMORPGs, massive multiplayer online role-playing games. Essentially, these were big open-world games with tons of other players, and you usually had to team up with other people to do missions and quests, fight big boss battles together, and generally work as a team, sometimes for hours at a time, to make progress in the game. Shifting from playing mostly solo to now needing to team up with other people took gaming to another level of useful as a language tool. One of the first large multiplayer games I played was called Fiesta Online. I was hooked to this game and would spend hours fighting slimes and doing quests to level up. But Fiesta quickly became a headbanger on the solo route. It took forever to level up, and quests just got too hard. The optimal strategy was to team up with 3 or 4 other people and just ransack through a whole bunch of monsters to make progress as a group. So after pouring hours into the game and going about it alone, I realized that I was going to have to interact with other people. So I put my fears aside, finally flipped on the game chat, and started to type. I had to have been using incredibly broken English at the time, but people slowly started to understand me over time, and grammar mistakes didn't feel as costly in the game versus in front of my whole class in school. So I quickly opened up being comfortable making lots of mistakes as I tried to write, and I think this was a big benefit to my English. So Fiesta got me going writing a lot more in English, and I probably wrote tens of thousands of words in English just from that game alone. And the habit continued as I moved on to other multiplayer games like Perfect World. I kept writing to chat with other players, making mistakes, and learning from the in-game conversations around me. And I learned something interesting about the English language. I realized that there was this whole world of casual written English that I had not learned about from school. Terms like BRB for be right back, LOL for laugh out loud, gotcha, and TY as thank you. While these are kind of silly terms, they are part of the language and important to know if you want to become as fluent as natives. And I naturally wasn't learning them from school, nor were we all texting each other then as is more customary now. So tactic number 2 is that I used game chats as my primary source for learning informal English and slang. It was like discovering a secret code, and I got a lot of practice in informal English by using game chats to write to other players. But then another game trend started to emerge. People started using voice chat to talk to other players live. So when I jumped to Minecraft as my next game, I found a cheap pair of earbuds with a mic attached to it, and I used that to kick off the next chapter of my English journey. I would join 2 or 3 friends online, we'd fire up a voice chat, and we would dive into the game, calling out battle formations and strategies as we raided villages in Minecraft, looking for secret chests of rare items. Similar to written game chats, I started out nervously saying very little and mostly listening, but I quickly built my confidence and became okay with making mistakes once I realized that my friends didn't care about my broken English. They just wanted to understand me enough to win the game. So I started to jump in and call shots too, and my informal spoken English began to improve. By this point, games had given me a strong set of advanced, niche vocabulary, and then they had started to refine my written and spoken informal English and slang in multiplayer modes. But how did this all tie together to make me more fluent in English? Well, the third tactic I picked up later, closer to middle school, when I switched from playing computer games to console games for the first time. I was a starry-eyed kid as I stared at titles like Legend of Zelda, Elder Scrolls, Call of Duty, and more. And by this point, I had started to take note of the impact games were having on my English skills, so I started to use them more intentionally to improve my fluency. By now, I had a solid level of basic English, and I had graduated out of ESL and was getting some of the highest English scores in my school. But it was time to push past the standard conversational and school English and move to a level where I could really weave and deploy the English language to tell rich and captivating stories with ease. This is when I began to stumble on big story games like God of War, where the gameplay was awesome, but you also had insanely cool stories and narratives interwoven into the game, with cutscenes that would narrate the game's lore to you as if you were watching a movie that you could take part in and control. So when I flipped on the original God of War and heard the story of Kratos, I was instantly hooked.
And Kratos cast himself from the highest mountain in all of Greece.
Hearing a super cool voice read to me the story of Kratos and his adventures in Athens, Greece, felt like magic to my imaginative kid brain at the time. And I would sometimes lose on purpose to try and find ways to replay cutscenes just to hear those stories again. All this time, my brain was working in the background like clockwork, listening to this more poetic side of English and learning how to build a story and craft a beautiful narrative using the English language. And whatever I didn't understand, I could now use a combination of the game audio, the visuals on screen, and the gameplay quests to figure out what the story had been saying. The habit of listening to game stories became a key part of my English learning, and I carried it into other favorite games like Prince of Persia that also had this formal, storytelling, fantasy adventure type of language.
Some believed when the prince journeyed to the island of time to escape death, that he returned alone.
So as I played these games, I would listen to and learn from these formal storytelling styles of speaking that I seldom encountered in my day-to-day. And it began to influence the way I spoke, wrote, and thought about English. So tactic number 3 for me was that I listened to and read game lores to learn how to craft stories in English. And not all these stories were these beautiful, poetic, fantasy tales that you would want to read aloud to a classroom. Even game titles like Grand Theft Auto, Vice City provided their own language lessons at the time. GTA showed me very informal storytelling in colloquial English, and it helps me listen to different accents from the various characters and scenes in the game.
Gotta redecorate this place. We gotta make it look older. I can't stand this look.
It's my favorite El Burro movie. It's Die. What else can I do?
While I wasn't going to take all the things from GTA back into the classroom necessarily, listening to the audio for that game helped broaden my ability to understand informal registers of English. Now, tactic number 4 is something I'm still experiencing now. My English is hopefully strong by this point, and I haven't spent much time gaming in the past years, but whenever I take a glance back over, I'm always pleasantly surprised at how, even to this day, I still stumble on new language lessons from games that improve my English. When I jumped onto League of Legends, for example, one of the first things I stumbled on was a game item called Boots of Lucidity, and I did not know this term, so I learned it, added it to my English repository, and now I have yet another tally in the list of English words that I've learned from games. But besides the vocabulary, reading, listening, and player interactions that we mentioned before, there's another language use case that I'm excited to see in gaming going forward, and Skyrim is taking the leap to show us how this might work. Characters in games like Skyrim have always been programmed to have dialogue with players, but this dialogue has always been scripted and limited. In the near future, it seems like it might become possible to have hour-long conversations with characters in the game and ask them all about their backstory and talk about different things. As AI like ChatGPT continue to develop, it seems like we'll even be able to talk to characters in different languages and turn video game characters into language exchange partners, all while you're immersed in a game world you're interested in to help boost your language progress. One test of this is a Skyrim mod called Herika, the ChatGPT companion, and it allows you to speak about almost anything with this NPC that can crack jokes and tell you all about its background in the game.
Pokemon, now that's an interesting topic. Hard to choose just one favorite, you know? But if I had to pick, I'd say my favorite Pokemon is Meowth.
We've even seen other mods that you bring Spanish and other languages into the game. So I'd summarize the last tactic number 4 as combine AI and gaming to create a deeper level of immersive language practice. Then as you become fluent, go out and use your language skills to build meaningful relationships and unlock adventures in the real world. So that's a bit of my English learning journey, and it's just one way to do it. Regardless of the approach you take, if you're a gamer, try to take notice of how games contribute to your language skills and look for ways to intentionally amplify their benefits using any of these tactics to help you become more fluent. And if you get stuck at the speaking stage like I did, then check out this language app I built to make it easy for anyone to practice speaking Spanish from wherever you are in the world to become fluent. So I'll see you there, and hasta la próxima.